All right, welcome and good afternoon. My name is Hillary and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the New York Transit Museum. Our museum is located in downtown Brooklyn in a decommissioned I&D subway station. Hope you visit us. The museum is open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We also have a gallery and store in Grand Central, which is currently hosting our holiday train show. That's a program you don't want to miss, especially as the holidays approach. Now, today's program is part of our series, Mining the Archives, in which we dig into the museum's expansive collections and share the stories of our artifacts with you. This week's edition is about the unexpected connection between vending machines and transit. Before we get started, I wanted to give a quick nod to some of our upcoming programs, and I'll put some links in the chat in just a second. On December 4th, we're going to be hosting a transit scheduling kind of 101 program at the museum. This will be featuring the head of scheduling of buses and subways and the MTA's Open Data Manager. That's going to be live at our museum, 6 p.m. December 4th. And on December 16th, we have a virtual program with Matthew Algeo presenting his new book, New York Secret Subway, about the first underground passenger railroad in New York City 30 years before the IRT opened. That book is a lot of fun. So definitely you can join us for that. Here's those links. We also have, if you're around in New York for the holidays, our holiday nostalgia trains will be traveling on Sundays in the city, so hop on and off for the price of a subway fare. You can find the schedule and route on our website. So we hope to see you there. As always, if you're signed up for our newsletter, you won't miss any program announcements. But okay, for today's program, if you would like captions, please click on the menu item that says CC Show Captions. If you don't see that option, just click on the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen and you'll see a full menu. Now we might have some time for Q&A at the end, but feel free to use the chat to comment and share questions and respond to each other during the program. So now, without further ado, I'm happy to introduce today's presenter, the fantastic Polly Desjardins, the museum's content and research manager, who will showcase the history of vending machines and mass transit. So Polly, happy to hand over the mic to you.
Thanks, Hillary. Thank you so much. Yeah, people definitely catch a ride on holiday nostalgia rides. They're a lot of fun. So here we go. New York City's subway system, of course, as we know, is over 120 years old. And before the tunnels were constructed, elevated train lines rumbled overhead, beginning in the late 1860s, creating a rapid transportation network that transformed the city, how its residents got around, and where they lived and worked. Not only did rapid transit help to relieve overcrowding in the densely populated neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan, it introduced New Yorkers to new technologies, products, and the conveniences of modern urban life. A part of this, even though they haven't been seen for almost 50 years, were the vending machines selling gum, chocolate, and peanuts, as well as machines that would tell you your weight, that were once ubiquitous throughout elevated and subway stations. In fact, we often get visitors of a certain age at the museum in our subway station home inquiring about where they can get their 1 penny chiclets. So today we're going to explore how these vending machines ended up in the transit system, how the system is intertwined with the history of chewing gum in the United States, what other kinds of products and services vending machines offered, and how the riding public sort of interacted with these machines until their demise in the 1970s. So in the late 19th century, public transportation in the city consisted of horse-drawn vehicles, electrified trolleys and streetcars, and the extensive elevated train lines rising above 6th Avenue, 9th Avenue, 3rd Avenue, and 2nd Avenues in Manhattan, where passengers could take a quick ride uptown or downtown for just a nickel. Stations and platforms became places where a captive audience was gathered hundreds of times a day with nothing to do but wait. What a great opportunity as an advertising and retail space, somewhere to make money from all those millions of people moving throughout the city. So a few years after the L's had been running in the late 1880s, a man named Artemus Ward and his business partner, Mr. Gow, won the advertising and concession contract with the Manhattan Elevated Railway Company, the folks running the L's, giving them the rights to sell from newsstands, to place vending machines in all the stations along the lines, and to place advertisements in the stations as well as on the trains themselves. And when the first subway, the IRT or Interborough Rapid Transit Company, which are today's number lines, when they opened in 1904, Ward and Gow's contract was extended to the underground stations as well. The IRT actually happened to lease all of the Manhattan Elevated Railway Company lines in 1903. So this was a huge opportunity and one that Mr. Ward held on to for many years. He speculated that putting newsstands and vending machines inside the stations and on the platforms rather than outside at the entrances would generate more sales because people wouldn't always be rushing by as they were at the entrance, right? He is credited with increasing magazine sales in this period and actually how much commuters read while they were traveling. It was also the start of the trash and litter problems that plagued the L's and the subway stations for years, particularly, of course, discarded newspapers. However, since this program is really focusing on vending machines, let's take a look at where they originated just for a moment. So I was really surprised to learn that coin-operated machines that dispense something in return can be dated back to ancient times. The earliest reference involved Hero, who was a mathematician, a physician, and an engineer. He may have been Egyptian or he may have been Greek, but not much is known about his life. But he did write books. And in one of his books, Pneumatica, Hero described and illustrated a coin operated device to dispense sacrificial or holy water in the temples. Now, it isn't clear if this machine was ever actually made and put into operation, but it was suggested that the water vendor was devised to try and increase revenue for the temples from their worshippers. So seemingly not much progress happened with vending machines for a few hundred years until the 17th century, when in England, snuff and tobacco boxes began to appear in inns and taverns. The pub, whereby a customer inserted a coin and the lid popped open, revealing the contents, just like the little box on the screen. What became known as the honours system was really relied upon to make sure that one person didn't actually take everything and only the pinch that they paid for. Um, some other early products that were vended in these coin-operated machines were postage stamps, postcards, and stationery. All sort of easy and lightweight kinds of products. And these vending machines were often to be found at railway stations. So, around the same time that New York City began moving the masses via elevated trains, over on Staten Island, the invention of modern chewing gum was taking place. Now, this was the first product ever sold in a vending machine in New York City on an elevated train platform, and it really became synonymous with the transit system for decades. Now, for millennia, people in the ancient world, in Central and South America and beyond, had been chewing the gum of the sapodilla or manilcara tree, otherwise known as chicle. In the mid 1800s, a local New York resident, a man named Thomas Adams, worked briefly for the exiled Mexican president, a man named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who stayed with Adams in his Staten Island home during this exile. Now, the president had access to large amounts of chicle from Mexico, and he suggested that perhaps Adams, a photographer, glassmaker, and inventor, along with his son might try to create a commercially viable product with the chicle. At first, Adams and his son attempted to turn the tree sap into a rubber-like material to use for products like toys, rain boots, and even bicycle tires, but the experiments were all failures. When he considered that chicle was consumed as chewing gum in Mexico, he decided that this could be a way for him to use the excess chicle that had been left over after all of these experiments. So, though gum was already available in American drugstores, it was really a sort of unsatisfying chew that was made from sweetened paraffin wax. Ugh. Um, Adams and his son decided to begin manufacturing chicle gum, which went on sale in stores in 1871. It was called Adams New York Chewing Gum. And as you can see, there was a picture of New York's City Hall on the label of the box, which contained the gumballs that were all wrapped in different colored paper, and they were 1 penny a piece. So Adams took out a patent to protect his gum invention, and eventually he opened a factory on Sand Street in Brooklyn with machinery to produce the gum in huge quantities. It employed a great deal of people, including a lot of women and girls. The photograph on the screen on the left there isn't Adams' Sand Street factory, but a later chewing gum factory that we'll talk about in a little while. So the first flavored gum that Adams produced was called Blackjack, and it contained licorice. However, it was tutti frutti flavor that first made it into the vending machines on mass transit platforms in the 1880s. And I tell you, it was a huge hit from the get-go. In fact, the vending machines and the gum inside had become so popular that by the time of the Columbia Exposition, or the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, visitors could go to one of the magnificent Adams Tutti Frutti stands or one of about 300 gum vending machines scattered throughout the fairgrounds. As a mark of just how popular and common they become by this time, a reporter for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle who attended the fair commented that standing before one of these familiar objects, the Brooklyn man instinctively listens for the call, bridge train, with which they became identified at home, and he feels an involuntary sympathetic motion of the jaws as he watches the long files waiting for their turn at the slot. So, chewing gum and the vending machines it was sold out of made their debut on the platforms of the city's elevated train lines. And as New York grew and got busier with business and commerce and people, the transit system was expanded, including building a system of subway tunnels through the city. And during the construction of the first subway between 1900 and 1904, a lot of thought and money had been put into the designs and the decorations of the stations, partly in the hopes, of course, that it would raise the moral and civic virtue of the riding public by exposing them to art and beauty and magnificent architecture. So, when the subway opened with advertising posters and vending machines in the stations, it really wasn't without great controversy. Many people and organizations, including the Municipal Art Society, thought that the ads and the slot machines, as they called the vending machines, marred the beauty of the stations and all the work that had gone into, providing their beautiful appearance. Surely, billboards for products to cure constipation did not comport with the ideals that they were trying to follow. Even the architects for the IRT, again, the first private subway operator, who had spared no expense in their designs, had no idea Ward and Gow would begin hanging ads in the subway immediately upon opening. The image on the right of the screen, of course, is the old City Hall subway station platform, the IRT's most lovely and elegant station that opened in 1904. And you can see that despite the outcry, advertisements and vending machines found their way onto even this lovely platform. So, according to author Clifton Hood in his excellent book, 722 Miles, he said, aroused by this strong negative reaction, the municipal government filed a lawsuit against the IRT to eliminate the ads. The Interborough expected to earn about $500,000 from this concession and vigorously defended its contractual rights. The company won and the case several years later. And of course, the signs remained, which was an early indication that the subway was assuming a more pedestrian place in the life of the city. And battles, of course, weren't confined just to the ads. The vending machines were also considered unsightly and a hazard. And when the first subway stations opened in Brooklyn in 1908, again, there were resounding calls to have them removed. The Public Service Commission, the city body that had oversight of the subways, opposed the vending machines because they really saw them as a hindrance to foot traffic on the platforms. And they were especially aggrieved at the machines that also displayed advertisements. Again, the rights of the subway companies to continue were vigorously defended and, of course, won out over any objections because, frankly, there was just too much money to be made. Let's take a minute to consider how train passengers got their candy and snacks before vending machines came along. It's a fact that railroad passengers have always been a great and captive market for those who want to make a quick dollar. Folks called candy butchers, a term that may have originated in the circus, were prevalent on railroad trains across the country in the 1800s. Many of these candy butchers were children, and for some, this was their entrepreneurial start in life. For example, Thomas Edison, when a young teenager, was a candy butcher on the Ohio Grand Trunk Railroad, which was, an early Edison business. Selling on trains, of course, didn't cease with the introduction of vending machines and even with the convenience of newsstands on station platforms. You rarely see a subway rider today reading an actual physical newspaper, but of course, in New York anyway, there's been an uptick in candy butchers on the subway recently. The images on the left show a couple of very young gum sellers by a subway kiosk entrance. That one was to 23rd Street Station in 1910. And we have a newsboy working an IRT subway car there in 1943. Now, whatever objections may have existed, just 2 decades after the subway opened, there were literally thousands of vending machines around the city. But of those thousands of machines, the most successful were the ones placed on elevated and subway platforms. According to one man who owned and operated 400 vending machines at the time, he said, slot machines pay wherever people wait for 2 minutes or more. We catch the odd pennies of a man in a moment of idleness. This same man seldom buys gum or chocolate in a store. Perhaps he seldom eats it. Patronizing the slot machine helps him kill time, and there isn't much else to do when waiting for a train. He noted that his sales rose noticeably when the school year was in session because of the great number of students who used transit to get to and from school with their noticeable sweet tooths. Now, Thomas Adam and others around the country, like William Wrigley, were making a fortune selling gum. Because of this enormous success, in 1899, they formed the American Chicle Company, consolidating several of the biggest gum makers into one company, and they opened a huge factory in Long Island City in 1910. Its products eventually grew to include breath mints, antacids, cough drops, and other items. So Kraft owned the vestige of the company today. Chiclets, the most famous of their gum brands, were introduced in 1915 and only discontinued around 20 years or so ago. In 1911, the vending machine industry in the US followed the gum manufacturers and consolidated, creating a large company known as the Auto Sales Gum and Chocolate Company, who manufactured enormous amounts of vending machines. So let's take a look at what folks could buy in these vending machines. For a penny and later a nickel, a passenger could buy three basic edible products in vending machines in rail stations. Gum, of course, which we're going to come back to, but it's worth noting here that it was an easy product to vend because of its size, the fact that it was pretty shelf stable and wasn't vulnerable to the elements. Another product was peanuts. They were cheap. They could be doled out in an easy small amount and were most often dispensed from rounded glass machines that kind of looked like a traditional gumball machine, but there were other designs too, as we can see on the screen. Now, this salty snack must have been popular because by 1954, according to the press, peanut vending machines in the transit system distributed 15,000 pounds of peanuts each month. That means 90 tons of peanuts are gobbled up by local subway passengers each year. Oof. So out of the approximately 12,000 machines spread throughout the city, about 1,500 of them were dedicated to peanuts at this time. Another snack that you could buy was chocolate, a perennial favorite of almost everyone. The Stolwerk brothers, who were the premier cocoa and chocolate maker in Germany at the turn of the 20th century, they actually had a large plant in Stamford, Connecticut, and won the right to place their vending machines and products in IRT, elevated and subway stations. On the slide, you can see one of these chocolate machines installed at the newly opened Brooklyn Bridge IRT subway station in 1904, with some of those offensive advertising posters on the walls behind. Stolwerk were one of the biggest chocolate makers in Europe, and as they expanded around the world, they saw the benefits of selling through vending machines. It was actually reported in 1909 that the Stolwerk machines brought in a daily income of approximately $2,000 just from the subway and elevated platform machines. They were, of course, not the only chocolate company to sell in the subway. You could get a Hershey bar at hundreds of machines and stations throughout the city. Chocolate bars, were easy to house and dispense, but they were vulnerable to temperature swings, especially heat. Hershey's, the company, faced complaints from competitors about conspiring to dominate the trade using a special chocolate bar for use in vending machines, which I assume was about the candy bar's size. And just take a look at the variety of bars available in this vending machine at the Times Square 42nd Street IRT station. There are slots for 8 different kinds of product. Oof. So by the time this photo was taken in 1957, the price was often 5 cents, a nickel, for a bar of chocolate rather than just a penny. Now, after New Yorkers had consumed all those peanuts, gum, and chocolate, it's a mystery to me why they should then want to weigh themselves. But there you have it. The other kind of vending experience that Subway and L passengers had access to in abundance were weighing machines. Penny weighing machines had their heyday in the 1920s and 30s, when, if you think about it, most people had to go to the doctors to get weighed. So having these machines in public spaces offered a service that people hadn't had access to before. Now, a contemporary collector of these machines noted that back in those days, people were concerned about their weight, particularly not weighing enough, because at the time, this was a time when there were lots of tuberculosis outbreaks and the like, which often, ravaged people's health. The invention of these coin operated machines was recounted in a story in the New York Times from 1927 about an American salesman by the name of Frank Westbrook. So, one chilly evening around 1902, while awaiting a train in Chicago, bored, he wandered over to the baggage area where he noticed the freight scale and he decided to weigh himself. Shortly after, he dropped a penny in a gum vending machine on the same platform, but was sorely disappointed when nothing came out. Now, as he traveled home, he thought about the two machines and eventually developed an idea to build a penny in the slot weighing machine. Westbrook attracted investors and formed a company making the machines, which at the end made him a wealthy man. He ended up selling his company in 1922 for $3 million. Weighing machines were popular on railroad platforms, but hundreds were also placed in stores. Some machines had a visible dial to display the numbers, but apparently people began avoiding those machines because the answer was too public. Manufacturers then created machines that, instead of displaying the answer, printed it confidentially on a paper ticket. On one side, your weight, and on the other, a little fortune telling, much like a fortune cookie. You can see on the slide on the left of the screen where it says your weight and fate painted there on the side. Weighing machines came in many different styles, with when they had different needs depending upon where they were placed. For example, they needed to be somewhat weatherproof if they were outside on elevated platforms. And apparently, the lollipop style was the most popular. Now, in the early 20th century, as gum chewing became a more socially acceptable thing to do, especially while on the subway, another pastime began to occur in stations where there were vending machines. What we might refer to as primping, or spending time fixing yourself up in front of the mirrors that were attached to many of the gum machines, as you can see in the photographs on the slide. Now, the act of primping actually became a thing in the subway, especially among men, as reported by contemporary newspapers. And apparently, in 1915, women suffragists who were fighting hard for the right to vote took advantage of this primping phenomena. According to the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, they spent one day in November 1915 visiting all the IRT subway stations in Brooklyn, pasting "Vote Yes for Women's Suffrage" stickers on all the vending machine mirrors that they could find. One man at the Brooklyn Borough Hall station, the first subway station opened in Brooklyn, suddenly noticed a sticker on the mirror that he was in front of. A woman standing nearby asked him what he thought of the message. The man read it aloud and exclaimed, "You may bet a spice cake I'll vote for that little amendment. If women are clever enough to work such schemes as these, they are clever enough to vote. You have mine here and now, Miss Suffragist." Patronizing? Yes, but hey, at least the topic was being debated in public. By the 1920s, the New York Times declared it was the age of the slot machine. The number of products that you could buy from vending machines grew as technology developed and improved. Yet it remained true that the most successful in New York were the penny and nickel machines found at train stations across the city. And the denser the population and the more crammed the transportation lines, the more the machines flourished. In addition, there was a lot of hype during this period, particularly between the two world wars, that automation of services would expand. The vending industry believed that eventually robots would be able to sell anything, and that entire stores would be fully automatic. Think sort of things like the automat. In transit, as I mentioned before, the 1920s saw the first automatic turnstiles, its very own slot machines, if you will, into which a passenger could put a nickel, the subway fare from 1904 to 1948. When these new turnstiles were first installed, thousands of slugs entered the system, as many as 3,000 a day. It was no different for the vending machines. Slugs were just a perennial problem. Another effect of these new automatic turnstiles was that station positions like ticket attendant were eliminated and people ended up losing their jobs. And this mirrored fears, especially after the financial collapse in 1929, that machines in general would cause unemployment. And afterwards, any thoughts about vending machines taking over entire stores where people could do the selling really began to fall out of favor. When the New York City Transit Authority was created in 1953 to operate the subways and most of the bus lines, it was accompanied by the second fare hike in the city's history from a dime to 15 cents. This introduced a new fare media, the token, because the turnstiles were not designed to accept two different size coins or give change. Customers were able to buy tokens from vending machines, just like a piece of gum or chocolate, something they were already used to doing. Uh, we can see in the image the chairman of the New York City Transit Authority, Joseph E. O'Grady, promoting the use of token vending machines in 1958, just a few years after they were introduced. Of course, vending fare media continued even after the last tokens were bought in 2003 with MetroCard vending machines or MVMs. And now, of course, as we phase out MetroCards, you can buy an OmniCard at a vending machine. And with the amount of people using the system on a daily basis, there was no way that station booths and operators could have ever handled the volume of passengers needing assistance, not then, and certainly not today. Other kinds of vending machines made their way into the transit system beginning in the 1930s. The first ice cream machines were installed at two locations in 1937, and by the next decade, the first soft drinks machines began to appear. Beyond products that you paid for, New Yorkers' comfort with interacting with machines was really an advantage when it came to experimenting with services that the transit authority could provide. For example, they installed machines called directomats, which were automated information machines invented by Dr. Max Tamiya after he got lost in the subway and couldn't find help. The first machine was installed at Times Square subway station in 1956, followed by a directomat that was installed at the Transportation Building at 370 J Street in downtown Brooklyn. Customers would ask for directions by pressing buttons, and then the machine would dispense printed instructions. Pretty cool. Times Square subway station, having always been the busiest station in the city, was naturally the best site for testing out ideas like the Directomat with real customers in real time. Politicians also took advantage of the access to large amounts of voters moving through Times Square station and their savvy with automation and machines. For example, Senator Jacob Javits was running for re-election in New York in 1962. And to reach out to potential voters, he installed a machine that looked like a regular vending machine at the Times Square 42nd Street subway station, but it required no money. And what you got dispensed were his opinions on about 120 world issues. I think that was quite creative, actually. Now, to give you an idea of how much money could be made from all these machines, let's just take a quick look at some numbers. As an example of the sheer volume of vending machines in the transit system, a writer for a trade publication noted in 1930 that one could encounter at least 300 vending machines at Grand Central subway station. That's just one subway station. And as the system expanded, more and different opportunities were sought. With the construction of the independent subway system, or IND, beginning in the 1920s, newer subway stations were built with lots more space on the mezzanines, and the first stores to be installed underground were loft candy stores. They opened four branches in 1948. Three inside IND's subway stations in Manhattan, and one in the Hudson and Manhattan Tube Station. That's our path today. Underneath Gimbals in Greeley Square, which is today's Herald Square. And there's one of the Loft Candy stores on the screen. In the museum's collection, we have the papers of Ferdinand Roth, who was the director of the concessions department of the Board of Transportation during the 1940s and 50s. Now, by the time Mr. Roth was running this department, the Board of Transportation was getting revenues from many other kinds of concessions other than just the penny vending machines, as of course you can see on the slide, including the sale of newspapers, magazines, candy, flowers, baked goods, boot blacks, pay toilets, luncheonettes, and pay lockers. Telephone booths were also included. And so the total revenue for 1951, including all the above, plus advertising revenue, was equal to almost $5 million. And we've talked about all the money that these machines made, but they were also plagued by theft. And as I mentioned earlier, by slugs, things that resembled a penny or a nickel, but which weren't legal currency. From their very beginnings, the machines were an attractive target for crooks big and small. This was a victimless crime in many ways. At least the thieves didn't have to rob or hold up a real person. And often the machines were out in the open in public spaces, making them easy marks. Over the years, there were many cases of theft of either the machine's contents, the money that the people deposited, or the whole bloomin' machine itself. For example, in 1900, the Daily Standard Union reported that 20-year-old Thomas Quinn was arrested after he and a friend were caught in the act of breaking into the Tutti Frutti slot machines of the Newkirk Avenue station. Or how about the three teenage boys found with a screwdriver, a pair of pliers, 132 pennies, and many packages of gum, who confessed to robbing machines from three elevated stations in 1923? Or the sad story of a 16-year-old boy who robbed a gum machine for the pennies because he didn't want his family to go hungry during the Depression. By the 1960s, according to an official from the Interborough News Corp who had the concessions contract at that time, their losses ran at about $50,000 a year. They retrieved £25 worth of slugs and the like each month. But the main problem was paper stuffed into the coin slots. Vandals did this so that they could return later and get out any trapped coins, which of course reminds me of the token suckers that plagued some stations in Manhattan, whereby people would jam paper into the slot on a turnstile and wait for an unsuspecting rider to put in their token, get frustrated, go to another machine or the booth, and then the thief would return and literally suck the token from the slot, ready to sell to another rider. Yuck! And you can see a cartoon on the screen from as recently as 1990, people were sucking tokens. Now, with all the vending machines that you could encounter at one time or another, they probably invoked the wrath of the people using them when they didn't work correctly, or they swallowed the money, or they gave you nothing in return. For example, in 1938, an inspection of over 1,000 weighing machines in subway and elevated station showed that more than one-third were inaccurate, and 21 of them were in such bad shape that they were removed entirely. I'm sure many users complained about these defective machines because there are literally hundreds and hundreds of complaint letters in our archive about customers losing or wasting a penny or a nickel or several in vending machines throughout the transit system. This batch of letters and responses on the slide are all from the 60s and represent literally a fraction of the letters we have dealing with issues of all kinds. I'm sure you can imagine. As each letter was replied to, the response from the director of the concessions at the Board of Transportation was often on repeat. We know it must be frustrating to lose your money. Please complain to the operating company. They'll be happy to refund you, and so on. It generally cost the companies around 8 cents to replace the 1 penny that was originally lost. Now, I can understand being cross at not getting what you paid for, even if it cost just a penny, but I can only imagine how riders felt when the vending machine service employees went on strike in early 1949. The 125 men who filled the thousands of machines across the subway system and collected all the pennies and nickels to the tune of an average of 150 34-pound bags a day, each bag containing about $50 worth of coins. They struck for a 5-day, 35-hour week and more vacation. The striking workers plugged the coin slots of about two-thirds of the machines with pieces of tin and stopped refilling them. It was such a big deal that newspapers were reporting on the status of the situation vis-a-vis what you could still get and where. For example, on February 10th, 1949, at Times Square, 125 gum and chocolate machines were out of order. 8 peanut machines had about a 2-day supply, and 13 of them were completely empty. Three of the weighing machines were still accepting pennies, but the reporter couldn't say if the results were accurate. Now, this first strike must have been a success because they did it again a few years later in April 1953. According to the newspaper, by this time the workers had 12,000 machines to look after and struck for a $2 a week raise. The strike lasted just 11 days before people were able to get their gum, peanuts, and chocolate once again. As you can maybe tell from the headlines on the previous slide, the single most popular item vended in subway and elevated stations from the beginning of this practice until the end was chewing gum. Even during the Depression years, people still dropped pennies into the machines for their sweet treat. So when chewing gum became hard to find in the 1940s, New Yorkers really, really missed it. Gum became scarce during the Second World War for several reasons. For one, sugar to make gum sweet and palatable was being used to make explosives, and gum manufacturers were under rationing orders just like everyone else. The ships that carried the chicle to America to make the gum were needed instead for the war effort. And though demand increased across the board, most of the gum was diverted to the troops overseas and to the war workers in factories across the city and the country. Civilians had a much harder time getting hold of it. Gum's importance to the war effort was laid out in a New York Times article in January 1943. It said, today workers on war production lines are urged to chew gum to ease the strain of ever faster work. The army issues gum to aviators who chew it during nerve-wracking combat operations. It is part of the iron rations for troops going into difficult tropical terrain. It helps keep teeth clean when ordinary brushing is impossible. It helps quench thirst when water is not available. The humble stick of chewing gum has achieved an important place for itself. By 1944, the shortage of gum was so bad that chiclet vending machines in IND stations were locked up at the weekends and posted with signs reading, "Sorry, due to acute gum shortage, this machine will not operate on Saturdays or Sundays." The IRT and BMT kept their machines open but were reduced to Wrigley's Orbit gum, only because Wrigley's withdrew all its other flavors from the civilian market so they could make enough just for the troops. Chewing gum was so popular in the city that at one point in 1930, it was reported that a few experimental gum vending machines had been installed on the trains themselves. Apparently, about 100 cars on the Canarsie line, today's L line, and other scattered BMT lines were equipped, but they obviously didn't do very good business. Otherwise, I suspect that they would have been installed on all train lines. But you know what? Lucky for us, I think, that they were unsuccessful because if the train floors had been covered in discarded wads of gum, like the stations and the streets, it would have been terrible. In fact, the problem had gotten so bad that Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia sent out a press release in December 1939 about the gum disposal issue and wrote directly to the big gum manufacturers asking for their cooperation. He said, I should like to get your support in a campaign of education to induce users of chewing gum to dispose of used gum in a proper manner and not to throw it on the sidewalks. This may seem a most trifling matter, but it costs the city of New York literally hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to remove gum from park streets and public places. Of course, public places included the subway. The owners of Beech Nut Gum and Wrigley's Gum both agreed to print messages on their wrappers, and there were often built in trash cans for the gum and the wrappers underneath the vending machine itself, but that didn't seem to make much of a difference. Despite having two cleaners on special detail for 6 months, just scraping the floors at 14th Street, 34th Street, and 42nd Street subway stations, efforts to clean them was considered a futile and hopeless task. This photo of 50th Street station, taken in 1965, really shows the telltale black spots on the concrete floor, some of which were undoubtedly caused by carelessly discarded gum. And interestingly, in this image, we see the porter's room, who was the station cleaner, in addition to another vending concession that Transit made money off of, which was pay lockers that you can see over there. LaGuardia decided to start a contest to find a catchy slogan for the city's gun problem, and many New Yorkers sent in their ideas. Don't gum up the works was the most popular slogan, but others included chew it but don't strew it and don't be a gumbell. Personally, I think the artist Amelia Opdyke Jones, or Oppie, who created the posters that you see on the slide for the Subway Sun for the subway, did a much better job with her slogans and clever drawings. Of course, my favorite being "Quarantine the Gum Bug." So in the 1940s, with the highest ridership numbers ever, the Board of Transportation hired Oppie to create a courtesy campaign under this banner, the Subway Sun, really to try and deal with some of the worst and least desirable behaviors. And clearly, gum disposal was an issue that was continuing as a sticky problem for the city. The penny and nickel vending machines hung around until the decline of the transit system became more apparent during the 1970s. Their disappearance was due to several factors, including all the space that they took up and the real need to tidy up stations and remove obstructions to better move passengers and to cut down on trash. Perhaps more condemning, however, was the fact that by the 1970s, many of the machines were malfunctioning due to poor maintenance, theft, and sort of just general vandalism. In 1972, for example, the City Department of Consumer Affairs reported that 62% of the machines just didn't work properly, and 57% had nothing on them identifying where a consumer could go to complain. In 1974, the company that maintained all the vending machines decided not to renew its contract with the MTA, and they completed the removal of 6,000 machines across 95% of subway stations by the end of that year. No other companies stepped up that could meet the new standards for working order and cleanliness that the transit authority were looking for. And so, for the first time since the late 19th century, passengers could no longer vend gum, peanuts, or chocolate, nor weigh themselves anymore. Despite their long absence, vending machines, particularly gum machines, will always be remembered as part of the early riding experience. In 1988, MTA Arts and Design celebrated this piece of history, publishing the poem El Chicle as part of the Poetry in Motion campaign, which of course delights subway riders with poems and art on their daily commutes. And vending machines are back, actually, not in the same way that they were before, as you can see. Machines like the one for CVS products on the slide are much larger, and they sell many more and varied kinds of products because, of course, newer technology vending machines allow for that. They're not extensive yet, having been installed in just a very few stations. Gone is the candy, except at newsstands. But in 2019, as the MTA were considering ways to raise revenues, there were renewed calls for vending machines to be placed in the system in unused retail spaces, for example. So this machine is at 14th Street Union Square station on the mezzanine. It's one of the busiest stations in the city. And I would say that despite leading tours through this space and sort of traveling through the station pretty often, I actually haven't seen anybody using this vending machine. I'm not sure that I would risk my money in such a way. Generally, I prefer the human interaction you get at a brick and mortar store, but who knows what the future holds. So I thank you so much for listening and watching and for being with us, and hope that you will come back to the museum to do many more things with us. So thanks for spending an hour of your afternoon today.
Thank you so much, Polly. That was just such a great presentation. As always, you pulled together such an incredible range of stories and all these fantastic images from the archive. And there's so much research that went into this. And of course, this really is just a small sample of the museum's extensive collections and the many, many stories we are going to continue to tell through the Mining the Archive series. So you can learn more about our collections on our web resource. I'm going to include that link and a few others in our chat right now. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. We hope to see you at the museum in downtown Brooklyn or at our holiday train show at Grand Central, and at many of our other upcoming programs. You can check out our calendar. Also, if you enjoyed the program, please consider making a donation or becoming a member. Your support really allows us to continue doing all of this work. And thank you so much, Polly, for bringing your expertise to this presentation today.
My welcome. You're welcome. My absolute pleasure. I love it.
Wonderful. So thank you all for joining us today. It was great. We look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye now.